Okay, well, I think we're ready to get started. So good morning again for those of you joining us from the UK, and good afternoon to our audience in India. And welcome to today's panel discussion on the role of data in the mobility case, India and UK perspectives. My name is Lucette Demets. I'm the head of urban innovation for London Partners, which is London's international trade, investment and promotion agency. And it's my pleasure to be your chair for today's panel. We're delighted to be joined by a fantastic lineup of speakers, but also a wonderful audience for what I have no doubt will be an interesting, stimulating, and hopefully also helpful discussion. Before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with Zoom by now, but as we have a fairly large audience, please keep yourself on mute. You're very welcome to keep your video on if you wish. If you have a question you'd like to ask our panel, please use the chat function, which you can find on the Zoom screen. Or if you have any technical questions or issues, you can also raise them there, and one of our team will try and help you. And then just a final reminder for those of you who have just signed on, be very grateful if you could rename yourself to include both your personal name and your company name, which you can do by clicking on the three dots in the top right-hand corner of your image. Or alternatively, you can click on more next to your name in the participant list to do the same thing. If you did have any questions, as I said, please use the chat box to help to ask them. Today's event marks the start of a new partnership between London Partners and NASSCOM, who are jointly coming together to host this session. And before we start the panel, I would like to invite both Hemin Bharucha, Chief Representative of India for London Partners, and Kritika Murugesan, Director of 10,000 Startups at NASSCOM, to say a few words. Hemin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lucette. Good morning to everybody in London and good afternoon to everybody in India, and welcome to our event, The Role of Data in Mobility. We at London Partners have come together with NASSCOM to bring to you an excellent panel of experts who will be talking to us today about the opportunities in both London as well as in India for this very exciting sector. I think it is really an important sector and one that is going to be a sector of the future. My name is Hemin Bharucha and I'm the Chief Representative India for London Partners. For those of you who don't know, London Partners is the official economic development agency for London. We support Indian companies, young startups such as yours, to set up and grow globally using London as a hub. And equally, we work with London-based companies through our award-winning MIBP, the Mayor's International Business Program, to partner with companies like y'all and to do business internationally with countries like India. We in India, we have two offices, one in Mumbai and one in Bangalore. And we also work very closely with our partners, the Department of International Trade, who have offices across India to work with companies across India. My team, so I'm based in Mumbai, and Burzin Lath, who's Vice President for North and West of India, he's also helped organize this event. He's supported by Delzad Kapadia, who is our Business Development Executive. We have Divya Bajaj, who is Vice President for South and East of India, and she's supported by Neha Karnad, who is our Business Development Executive in Bangalore. We are obviously London headquartered, and Lucette, who is going to be our host for today, she's from London, as well as Harrison and Modi, who are all on this call to support you. We have offices, of course, in London, but also in North America. So that's USA, Canada, China, India, Germany, and France. All these offices are there to support your companies who are based in London, international companies who set up in London to grow their business globally. Before I stop, I would like to thank our partner NASSCOM. I would also like to thank our excellent panel of experts who you will hear from today. I'm sure it's going to be very exciting. And as Lucette said, this is the first session that we are hosting in this series, and I'm sure there will be many, many more which can help you. So thank you very much. And if I can invite Kritika Murugesan, Director for 10,000 Startups NASSCOM. Over to you, Kritika.
Thank you, Hemin. Firstly, a huge welcome to everybody, and it's an absolute pleasure to be hosting this session in partnership with London Partners, and I'd like to thank the entire team at London Partners for coming together on this, and we look forward to many more in these in the series, and this is the first one. To briefly introduce NASSCOM, it's the National Association for Software Service Companies. We basically represent the IT sector of India. We're a trade association, and to put it in a very short manner, I would say that we kind of represent the interests of the IT sector with various governments, and build in moving the ecosystem to the next level. As NASSCOM, we're a Section 8 company, not-for-profit organization, and while we work on many different initiatives and many different verticals, IT sector, IT services being at the helm of it, we also have a very good representation on GCCs, on engineering services, and also, of course, the startups piece, I will come to that and go a little more deep into that. But we do a wide spectrum of, very verticalized kind of attention to different set of the IT sector. And we do a lot of policy level work with state and center. And talent is another huge piece that we work on across initiatives and across the ecosystem. We have something called the Future Skills as well. And the whole idea and intention with the whole Future Skills program is to how do you build the existing talent and the talent that's coming into the industry to another level with new technologies and new areas of technology in terms of skilling them to the next level. One of the initiatives of NASSCOM is the 10,000 Startup Initiative, which we started in 2013 with the idea of saying, how do we boost this whole young entrepreneurial mindset more in this country, and how do we focus more on tech startups across the country. And we started with, of course, building physical spaces for startups to come and work from, and giving them that whole atmosphere in terms of mentorship, funding channels, enterprise connects, and all of that. Today, as we speak, in our 7-year journey, we have 6 warehouses, all are funded by different state governments. So it's highly subsidized for the startups. And of course, we focus a lot on the tech product startups. We've close to impacted over 6,500 startups in our journey till date. One of the key programs, while there's a whole lot of programs that we do in terms of a series of from basic of how to set up your startup, what are the legalities in terms of startup, to very high end in terms of what are kind of the funding needs, connecting them to investors, connecting them to enterprises, and a whole gamut of things. Can I have the next slide, please? One of our largest programs within the 10,000 Startup Program is the NASSCOM Industry Partnership Program. This is a program that's completely focused on connecting startups in a very, very highly curated manner to large corporates to look at solutions in terms of co-creation, in terms of solving for them, and all of that. Right. So this is one of our key programs that I'd like to really highlight, and this has changed the startup scenario itself for us in terms of helping them scale. Just another 20 seconds, and I just if you could just take me to the next slide, I'd just like to touch upon the kind of work that we've done and why and mobility space being a very, very important space for us. We've done multiple things in terms of identifying different kind of challenges to identify different kind of startups here, and it's been a good journey so far, and we hope that partnerships like this will create more scope for our startups to partner at a global level. With that, I will stop, and I know I'm out of time, and I hand back to Lucette. And again, thank you everyone for being part of this.
Thank you, Kritika, and thank you, Hemin, as well, for outlining the great ways in which both organizations can support businesses who are on the call today, and even others who may not be able to join us this morning. So that brings us on to kind of the topic of today's conversation on mobility. As most of you will know, the way we move around in our cities has been changing quite a lot in recent times, be that through the rise of new forms of mobility, a change in consumer expectation, impact of climate change, and of course, more recently, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's partly for that reason as well that it has become ever more vital that we innovate and collaborate, and that we do that through facilitating closer dialogues both between ecosystems as well as within the ecosystems between government organization, private companies, and citizens. So we can ensure that we develop the right solutions and create equitable, sustainable, and adaptable mobility ecosystems. And that's, of course, one of the key reasons we are starting this partnership and why we're here today, to facilitate that dialogue and closer collaboration between two of the leading global markets, the UK and India. Our two countries are, of course, already closely linked, and we have significant trade and investment flows in either direction. And if last week's visit by our International Trade Secretary, Liz Truss, is anything to go by, that will only set to increase as we map the path to a potential future free trade deal and even deepen ties and collaborations. Today, of course, we're going to focus on mobility, a market which is expected to touch $90 billion by 2030 in India. So that's no small feat. We're going to talk in the discussion about key trends and priorities in both markets, in particular in the space of connected, autonomous, shared, and electric mobility. We'll reflect on the impact, particularly in the mid to long term, of COVID-19, the very important role that data and technology will play in mobility innovation, and of course, how we can better collaborate. As mentioned at the start, there is an opportunity to submit any questions you'd like to ask to our speakers. You can do that by using the chat function on Zoom, and we'll try and address as many as we can through the course of today's conversation. Before we commence, I'd like to briefly welcome and introduce our four speakers for today. So firstly, we're joined by Andrew Rohan. Andrew is the Managing Director at Plexel, which is one of London's leading innovation hubs. Andrew leads the innovation consultancy and is focused on convening a community to solve the challenges that matter most to society, from the future of mobility to cybersecurity and social inclusion. Andrew has spent the predominant part of his career in technology infrastructure sectors, driving business transformation both for enterprise and city clients. Next, we are joined by Aparmaya Shukla, who's the Senior Manager at Nissan Motors in India. Aparmaya brings over 16 years of experience in the automotive industry, both in manufacturing as well as management consulting roles. He specializes in digital mobility and sales and operation transformation programs. Currently, he's working on intelligent mobility and customer experience as part of his professional engagement. He'll be speaking here today in a personal capacity. Next, we are joined by Dr. Manaswini Rath, who's the Vice President and Global Head of Autonomous Driving for KPIT, a leading multinational company providing software to the automotive industry. Manaswini probably leads one of the largest engineering teams globally developing software for autonomous vehicles from levels 2 to levels 5 of autonomy. She has over 25 years of experience in the safety industry and actively contributes in global forums on autonomous driving. And last but not least, we're joined by Maya Pindeus. Maya is the CEO and co-founder at Humanizing Autonomy, a rapidly growing innovative AI company that develops a global standard for human interaction with machines. Maya is a human experience designer, architect, and engineer with a deep passion for human and machine interactions. She works at the intersection of engineering, robotics, and user experience, and her work has been widely recognized across the industry with multiple awards, publications, and top rankings. So I hope you'll agree with me, we have a fantastic lineup of experts here for you, covering views on both markets. So without further ado, I'm going to start us up the conversation by reflecting a bit on the trends in mobility innovation in both markets. And Andrew, I'll come to you first. You obviously lead one of London's main innovation hub. What are some of the key trends you've seen in recent times, and how are they influencing the industry in London?
Thanks, Lucette, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to have a chat. So I think it's a fascinating time to be involved in mobility around the world. And I've picked out 6 key trends that we are observing at the moment. And the fact, that there are 6 major trends really outline how transformative this moment is for mobility, which is why all of us are so excited about participating in this marketplace. But B, how complicated it is as well. So these trends are macro trends that we all must be aware of and understand where our product or our service fits within in the context of these trends. So the first one we're observing is the obvious emergence of several new business models. And of course, this is not a new debate, the emergence of ride-sharing applications, by example, or real-time data pushing people around cities intelligently in different ways. I think the really important thing to note on this trend is that we're still at the arbitrage phase of transformation. What I expect to see over the course of the next 5 or 10 years is significant transformation to the actual service. So in the case of ride sharing, not just an application that allows us to arbitrage taxi rides, for example, but actually the application that drives federated ride sharing of private vehicles. Secondly, traditional verticals being challenged with no clear owner emerging. So of course we'll have much debate today about automotive and other sectors, but mobility presents itself with such a transformation challenge, and there is genuine opportunity for a sector to stand up and claim ownership, and we're not yet seeing that. Thirdly, the on-demand culture that this decade and the one before it has prompted, everything as a service. That's changing the way people think of what they buy, how they buy it, and the relationship between the consumer and the provider. Fourthly, an awoken society. So no longer will a consumer accept a subpar delivery, but also the ethics and the standards and the sustainability of the service must be appreciated and delivered. Finally, and much for debate today, so the acronym CASE of Connected, Autonomous, Shared and Electric, I think there are massive gaps between those letters in collaboration, alignment and understanding. And I think for all of us to take on board how we must come together and collaborate more. And then finally, on a similar point, is a question on what levels of public intervention are required to move this activity forward. And then how will collaboration either support that or replace the government intervention in causing this to happen? So those are the major trends. Thanks, Lucette.
Thanks, Andrew, for kicking us off to a very good start and some key discussion points. I'm not going to repeat all 6 trends, but certainly the point about CASE and the gap between those letters, I think, is certainly one that will come up more for discussion. But I'm going to kind of come to Aparmaya next to kind of maybe respond to those trends a little bit and reflect on how they affect the market in India more specifically.
If we look at the trend in the Indian market, we have to realize that it is trying to align itself with the global trend. And with that in mind, there's a comprehensive set of use cases that the industry is trying to work upon either in India or globally. And therefore, I would like to touch upon some of these use cases as we move along. The first one is work happening in the field of augmented reality, where we are talking about something called heads-up displays, which display navigation arrows on the road in front of the car so that the driver can continue to drive in a non-distracted fashion without looking at the infotainment screen inside the car. That's augmented reality for us. Another use case is AI-powered voice assistants inside the car, which have moved over from the old days of text-to-speech capability to the deep meaning capability that they have acquired today, which means that they can understand and interpret very long, convoluted, and complex queries from the driver of the car. Next up is navigation, where we have the capability to get daily traffic updates, real-time alerts, able to download the maps with very low latency, very low bandwidth requirements, be able to navigate with absolutely zero GPS signal availability. We have centimeter level location accuracy, decimeter level HD mapping accuracy, which to me is cutting edge. There's also a unique addressing technology by a company called What3 Words that lets you navigate to your destination without a cellular network. Next up is the smart city solutions, which is basically cellular V2X that lets users on the road communicate with each other, which is cars, pedestrians, cyclists, other road users, the roadside infrastructure, etc., to make safety a common priority and concern for everyone. And this works even in non-direct line of sight communications, which means you might not be able to see the other party, but you can still get the alerts. There's work happening in the ADAS space, a lot of them familiar to us, but I would like to pinpoint this particular autonomous drive level 4 parking experiment that Bosch and Mercedes-Benz have done in Stuttgart in Germany. What you could do is leave your car at the entrance of the car park. The car parks itself by speaking to the infrastructure inside the parking garage. That's because they implement the common communication layer, and it works even in basement areas where you have zero GPS connectivity. Next up, EV, a very broad discipline in its own right, right from battery management systems to drivetrain management to microcontrollers, etc. But there are some specific customer experience centric use cases digitally enabled that I would hope to talk about as we move forward in this panel discussion. Very important point on security, rather starting from the Ethernet being secure inside the car to the CAN being secure inside the car to the exchange of messages, for example, cellular V2X messages being secured or your cloud infrastructure getting secured. All of that is a priority for the cybersecurity area. We have work happening in the autonomous drive space where you are looking at not just excellent eyes and ears for the car, which is your lidars, your radars, your sensors, but also the brain of the car, which is your compute capability that lets you process multiple neural networks at the same time, and the inference engine that lets you interpret the environment. Finally, some classic use cases around data connectivity, connected car platforms, where you have use cases like usage-based insurance, fleet telematics, very P2C consumer-specific use cases, in-market commerce use cases like Zego, etc., coming your way. I would like to say that the list of possibilities is really endless, and it's as long as we would want to imagine. But what really stands out is that your design must be influenced by your daily usage. Your car must be defined by the software, and the value you deliver to the customer must be defined by co-creation or collaboration. Thanks, Lucette.
Thank you, Aparmaya, for sharing some of those fantastic use cases and a clear indication of the increasingly dominant role technology will play in how we interact with not just with our vehicles, but also more broadly with our environment, which I'm sure our next two speakers will have a lot to say about. So I'm going to come over to Dr. Rath next. Manaswini, I was on a webinar quite recently where people were talking about data is the new concrete, which I quite like because we're kind of moving from hardcore infrastructure to probably infrastructure plus, if I can say that. I just wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the key trends you see in that perspective, particularly as it pertains to connected, autonomous, shared and electric mobility.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Lucette. So, yeah, I mean, as I believe data is a very key part of this whole case journey, especially autonomous driving. It is extremely clear and critical for the autonomous driving. As I can also extend my sentence to say autonomous do not exist without data. So why it is important and what is the trend, right? So for autonomous driving, the base technology is artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is based on learning the environment. I mean, the technology, the software has to learn what is the environment, what are the variations, objects in the environment. So you can imagine it's like a child in childhood learns everything that he sees, what is it, and association with it, right? The name, the figure, the color, the texture. So as the technology is learning the environment through artificial intelligence, and data is equally important there. So collecting the data is the first trend, and that is not like just drive around and capture the data in a camera, but the technology and the correctness of data capturing is extremely important. That leads to the volume of data to be done, right? Every geography, starting from London to say Europe to US, the variations looks to be limited. But we are talking today London versus India. I mean, there is 100% variation, the roads, the traffic, traffic signals, everything. So every other objects, I mean, in an Indian road, we have to first label a cow and a dog to train the autonomous driving that these are also objects on the road. So that is the depth of data and the large amount of data we are dealing with. And that leads to the third trend. How do you manage this data, store and process this data? So cloud is the trend, right? It cannot, I mean, nobody want to invest on high-end machines on a physical space because every inch of the space in big cities is cost. So cloud is the new trend, and then the whole architecture, the vehicle architecture, the case architecture. How do you consider this data while you are running on board, or you just use them on offline? So those kind of are very key trends. Data management, DevOps, the cloud technology, all the big names of the Hadoops and Kubernetes and all that. So that these are all used in Google and Netflix, and nobody knew that in engineering world today they will be needed, and they are existing today and coming into picture to our engineering world because of data. And there is a marriage of IT and engineering happening here because of the usage of the data. And just the last thing I would like to share with this community especially, there is a lot to be done in the technology area, data area. It's still unexplored. We are still at the very initial stage of data management and data integration with the onboard engineering. So startup community can look at a lot of such innovative ideas and they could do, but what is most important is this one idea that a startup will have may not see the day of the light if they do not figure out the right partnership. So partnership and ecosystem partnership is very key in this, because this large amount of data, even between OEMs and between tier ones and between solution provider like us, also there is a possibility of collaboration. It is at the end of the day, data of the environment. We all how to figure out to use them so that not everybody is investing or not everybody is wasting. So startup can play a role and even bring the ecosystem partner together, or the organizations like yours could do, and that will be a very big contribution to this.
Thank you so much, Manaswini, for those key insights and very well made points. And I think that might be my next phrase, cloud is the new train. Quite like that. So yeah. Thank you for that. And you made some key points around the fact that, it's not just about the volume of data and the processing, but also how we use that data and the convergence of different industries and learning the environment. Which gives me a nice segue into what Maya, no doubt, will talk about, as her company's kind of at the forefront of that AI learning between the vehicles and the people and other, maybe not so much animals, but I'll let Maya talk about that on the road. Maya, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Lucette. So what we envision when it comes to connected, automated, and a level of AI enabled technologies is essentially a world where any machine is able to interact with people and increase safety, productivity, efficiency, and actually well-being. We really create almost a standard of interaction, and by doing so, are able to really leap autonomy forward and enable full adoption. So what we're seeing increasingly, that autonomy works to a certain extent, but then when it encounters, I guess, the most important factors in its world, or inhabitants its world as people, it actually stagnates. Because there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of complexity around how we act, how certain behaviors, different environments, cultures, and so on. And it's important for an AI system to be able to ingest that and then create decisions based on human behavior. So it's really around establishing a global standard for human-machine interactions, invisible software layer, if you will, that is able to power any machine, where we're talking about it. Automated guided vehicle on a factory floor, an automated vehicle on a street, a CCTV camera on a roadside, a dash cam that you plug into your car, your mobile phone, anywhere there's AI-enabled capabilities. So what the prerequisite for that is making use and being able to leverage ubiquitous data. So data that works, we are able to collect it, we are able to derive from essentially any urban environment and actually make use of that in order to create a system that's diverse, a system that is able to really account for a variety of behaviors, edge cases, whether it's people, whether it's animals, whether it's rest of infrastructure. All of this is important. Otherwise, autonomy will just not work. So looking at that, so on one hand, we're talking about ubiquitous data and the ability to create a data network effect. The data network effect in terms of trends, in terms of requirements, really is incredibly important of building systems, implementing systems that learn, that are certain or uncertain, but if they're uncertain, they're actually able to learn to then gain certainty. The other one is ethics. We're seeing a very much increasing discourse on ethical AI solutions and building what we call a white box approach, building technology that is modular, that is explainable, is interpretable, and making this almost a standard for any type of AI deployment is on one hand a key trend, but actually a really, really important, again, prerequisite as we're building AI, applied AI that actually impacts society. When looking at ubiquity, at software, artificial intelligence software they are deployed anywhere in an urban environment, we need two core capabilities. On one hand, it's edge-based processors. And a key trend in our eyes is the increasing AI capabilities of small mobile chips, essentially allowing processing abilities to be embedded into any device, which something that was previously restricted almost to large GPUs to power AI algorithms. Now actually, any mobile phone can do it. And the implications of that is that, again, any device that we see, or any system that we see in an urban environment or a factory floor is able to incorporate a level of AI capabilities. And then, of course, there's the cloud. Right? We firmly believe in distributed processing. So not everything will be running on the edge, not everything will be running on the cloud, particularly if we're looking at safety critical technologies. And there again, it's around making sure that connectivity works, 5G, of course, being a major trend for the wider smart city and connected vehicles ecosystem. And really those two segments, really, increasing edge availability and increasing connectivity for cloud processing are probably the two key trends on top of ethics in AI. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maya, for sharing those key insights and, of course, the all-important aspect of people in this entire mobility system. So, yes, it's about the role of data in tech, but we mustn't forget there are people in the equation. And some really well-made points around, of course, ethics, standardization, and making it kind of easily accessible for people. I wonder if I could sort of lift us up a level for a moment, and Andrew might sort of come back to you. There's the kind of obvious question that is probably on everybody's minds and is unavoidable. What's the impact of the pandemic has been on mobility? Of course, in the short term, it's been very much everything coming to a standstill as we all not going anywhere. Clearly, that will hopefully change again in the near future with vaccinations, etc., coming on to curb the pandemic. But it has also had an impact in terms of, I think, people's expectations, how they use mobility, where they want to move. I was wondering if you could share some reflections on what you think in the mid to long term may be the impact on particularly the use of shared mobility versus public transit versus private vehicle usage.
Great. Thanks, Lucette. So, yeah, I mean, what a year it's been, and a particular focus on mobility and how disrupted the already disruptive sector has become. So, I mean, firstly, I'm a great believer that the shared, so the S in case, has the potential to lead the other three letters in terms of time frame for implementation, time frame for adoption. And I think the effect of COVID-19 is a significant challenge to that assertion. I think what we've seen in across the globe now is a focus on public health, a awareness of the conditions around one when they're traveling, and potentially a fear of the unknown, whether that unknown being an individual, an environment, a place, a destination. So I think that the shared movement, if we call it that, I think needs a moment of reflection and a moment of reaction as to how one will deal with what might be a multi-year temporary issue as the world, onboards the issue of COVID and understands the context of it going forward, or could be with us forever. So the public health awakening that we have all had. Is this something we learn from and we use as a basis for design going forward? So I think, and I think going back to my point around that I made earlier on around how can one identify what elements of this movement are? I think shared is one of those which is probably the most distributed of these activities. There is no one owner, there is no one standard setter for what an appropriate shared model would look like. And I think there's a role for collaboration there and a role for understanding the basis for how we proceed. Second issue I'd like to shine a light on is the financial distress that the last 12 months will have caused to governments around the world. And as a result, how that might trickle down into appetite to fund public services. In particularly, the implications on public transport and what that might mean. Now, I think it's a financial reality that the transport agencies around the various metros in the world will be challenged. And I think that will do two things. So firstly, it will encourage activity through and away from public services. So when I say through, I mean potentially looking at ticket prices, using data more readily within the public environment, and away from, I think there will be some sort of collaboration between public services and private services in order to make sure that service levels can remain high, but efficiency is focused on in order to drive that financial goal. I also think there's an opportunity for innovation. So let's hope that the providers of metro public transport services are now more open to transformation. They are more embracing what must happen, not what could happen. And then finally, I think we're going to see, if we haven't already, the emergence of much more sophisticated use of real-time personal and movement data. So I think, again, the public health environment, and we've seen a number of mobility as a service providers already do this, but understanding congestion, cleanliness, destination factors, and how one might move around more efficiently. I think COVID-19 might inject some real drive around that, the use of that real-time data for both social and economic good.
Thanks, Andrew, for setting out those key points on particularly the impact, but maybe also the growth of shared, and the financial, obviously, impact that's going to lead to more innovation and probably better use of data. And I think I might come to Maya next to kind of see how that has kind of played in the short to midterm for a business like humanizing autonomy. What kind of level of engagement or change have you seen in engagement with cities and public transit agencies?
Yeah, I mean, I do echo with a lot of what Andrew was saying around the increasing understanding of probably public sector, transport authorities, and so that innovation needs to happen at a quicker pace. I think the pandemic had actually really shown that. And then what we're seeing is kind of in a macro environment, right, is that on one hand, the COVID-19 is creating a certain acceleration of innovation, particularly with sectors that have experienced a lot of strain. So on one hand, the supply chain, right, that was very, very much impacted by increasing demand, really, and have accelerated automation in that sector. On the other hand, we have public transportation transport authorities that had to change their policies basically on a daily basis starting in March. And what we have experienced is that some of our long-standing partnerships with mobility operators and so on have led to almost a willingness of applying data-based analytics, video analytics, specifically in our sector around people's flows, human behaviors in certain public spaces, to use those as an input to more agile policy planning. So a good example would be Transport for Greater Manchester, who we've partnered with early last year and around major public junctions across Manchester to really understand the impact of social distancing, the flow of people, the usage of public spaces, and use those outputs to then inform decisions on a municipality and transport authority level. And we're seeing that essentially this agility that we're talking about in the private sector, in the automotive, in the mobility sector, around shared data, data analytics, and actually entering the public sector. And I think that's really, really promising, because if there's one thing that this pandemic has shown is that things can change very, very quickly. And decision-making process it took a lot of, long time, have to be dramatically shortened. And I think using AI for that is one good step forward.
Thanks, Maya. So some interesting perspective, I think, from the UK and London in particular, and probably interesting to contrast that with India, which is obviously a very different market and perhaps a different division between public transit and kind of private. So in London, in a pre-COVID times, you know, we'd have seen around 63-64% of people using public transit to move around. Obviously, during COVID, completely different picture. See what that looks like going forward. Manaswini, I thought I might come to you first. Are some of those trends resonating in terms of the India market? Do you see similar trends in public transit agencies changing more quickly, making more use of data, or is it quite a different picture?
Yeah, I mean, I will take the lead from what Maya said is the speed at which this public transport organization should take decision or change the way they want to operate is the need, but in India, same, the decision and all happens slow. But there is a trend in India that people are moving to personal vehicles, at least those who can afford to. And at least the sales data of the vehicles in India show that. Surprisingly, even during COVID, in the September sales of number of cars in India was more than the September sales of 2019. And that trend clearly says that those who can, who were taking public transport are choosing to be in private transport, whatever, fear or choice and all. But if you see the volumes that the users in India, be it personal vehicle or public transport, equally big, right? So there is a large segment who would use this public, the public sources. But the usage of data in those kind of transport is very less, meaning whether they are taking some decision and putting some intelligent systems around to support the transportation system. I would say it's not on ground yet. There is discussion. There was a huge trend of getting the telematics in place, at least managing the vehicles remotely and all. Otherwise, in-vehicle public transport, any of such support which is directly related to public, we don't see much, and that's where a lot of innovation could happen.
So not quite the speed yet that we're hoping to see in terms of transformation.
Yeah.
But it's interesting though how COVID has had a significant impact, and perhaps another point to maybe briefly touch on is in the UK very much, I mean, obviously we've seen similar trends, people having that fear of using public transit and maybe choosing privates if they are able to do so, or indeed not moving in many circumstances. But the government's view, and particularly in London, is very clear that we want to have a green recovery from the pandemic. So at all costs to avoid a purely car-based recovery. That would bring London to a halt and much of the UK as well. I'm wondering, Aparmaya, if you could reflect on what the sort of views are in India, both from an industry perspective or from a government perspective, on this recovery from COVID, and whether there's more of an emphasis on towards moving towards sustainable mobility, which of course the electrification, but also some of the shared mobility will have a key impact on.
Yeah, electrification, Lucette, has been a big priority for the last 6 to 8 months in India. Perhaps COVID has given us the time to think back and reflect on that key trend. A lot of states have come up with state-level policy initiatives. For example, Delhi, the national capital, and a large part of the southern territory of India, which is states like Karnataka, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, etc., all coming up in their own ways to support the drive towards electrification. Some are offering you free charging for your electric vehicles. Some are giving you waivers on your road tax and registration fees. Some are giving you incentives to set up charging infrastructure. They have their different ways of doing it, but the common intent remains the same, which is the drive towards electrification. And they all have a certain vision of the percentage of electrification they would like to achieve among the new cars sold on the state roads at varying points of time from 2024 to 2030. Which means there's a clear medium to long-term policy planning in place. What's even better is that this is tying up very well to the federal policy think tank, the Niti Aayog, which has done its calculations and which believes that there's about $40 billion of savings on crude oil import that India could realize if we could get to a certain percentage of electrification in this country by 2030. So that's the work happening on the policy side. A lot of good work happening in the corporate sector as well. MG Motors is trying to set up responsible recycling for its ZS EV batteries in India. They are trying to set up super fast charging networks, 660 watt all across the country. And they've started very recently, the city of Coimbatore in the southern part of India was in the news for a charging station getting set up at the MG dealership. There's news about new vehicle launch announcements such as Tesla Model 3, how could we forget that, Volkswagen ID4. But what's even better is that there are country boys like Pravek Dynamics. It's a local SUV manufacturer that has announced the launch of its electric vehicle SUV, and it focuses on technologies like regenerative braking, etc. Toyota is pumping in money to the tune of 2,000 crores in the Indian EV market, using that to set up a base for both domestic sales as well as exports. There's also work happening in intelligent mobility on the two-wheeler side. There's a startup called Ather Energy, which in many ways follows the Tesla model in the sense that before it enters a given city in India, it sets up charging infrastructure of its own in that city and then makes an entry. Talking about more model launches, let's not forget Mercedes EQC as well. And that's an important example because Tesla sounds apprehensive about the Indian appetite for luxury electric vehicles. Mercedes-Benz EQC is a vehicle that's priced at 10 million Indian rupees, which is a lot, honestly. It got sold in just 3 months of its launch. The batch 1 was sold in just 3 months of launch, and today the company is importing the second batch of Benz EQC. So a lot of good news happening, but let's not get carried away with the positive part of it. Let's also realize that there is much work to be done. It's a work in progress status. It's journey in motion. In the middle of all this good news, we also hear about electric mobility startups that are struggling with pre-Series A financing. And that to me is an indicator that the ecosystem still needs to come together, because if you have a startup that has a good value proposition in the electric mobility space and it is struggling for money, it is struggling for support to get on its feet with regards to its business model, then we as stakeholders in the ecosystem need to join hands and make this happen collectively for the Indian market. Thanks, Lucette.
Thanks, Aparmaya. And it's great to see that there is a clear move towards bringing in more policies and focusing on electrification. I was wondering, from your perspective, what are some of the major challenges? You talked a little bit about startups and financing, but so say in Europe or in the UK, we see things around people maybe being hesitant to buy EVs because there may not be enough charging infrastructure and they have range anxiety, or indeed the costs are still too prohibitively high for the majority of people. In the India market, where is the biggest need? Is it around the kind of behavioral shift at the consumer level? Is it pricing? Is it charging infrastructure? Is it bringing in more clean energy? Where do you kind of see the main issue?
There are a couple of issues. One is range anxiety for sure. There needs to be assurance given to the public that there are ways to tackle range anxiety. Setting up public charging infrastructures is just one part of the answer. There are questions around the cost associated with the technology itself, and that's where the waivers and the financial and the non-financial support initiatives from the government kicks in. There's anxiety around how widely this would be adopted and how seriously this would be taken up by EVs manufacturers going ahead. And part of that is answered by the fact that there are local EV SUV manufacturers as well that are getting into this space. So while public at large is correct about its apprehensions, and there's reason to believe that we should be cautious about the drive to electrification, climate friendliness is not the only answer. There are practical consequential problems to deal with, but then there is support coming in from all quarters. What could improve is the startup community support. Like I pointed out, there are still a good amount of startups that are doing excellent work in this space, but because this is a new sector and because India as a market is not as mature as we would want it to be in the electric vehicle mobility space, there is still a need to pump up support in financial terms for these startups to get up and running in the quickest possible time. So while there are problems for sure, there's clearly an attempt to arrive at the answers as well.
Thanks, Aparmaya. Just a brief reminder to the audience that if you do have any questions you would like to ask of our speakers, please submit them in the chat box. But I want to pick up on the point of collaboration with startups and the need to kind of bring the ecosystem together more, not just in the areas of electrification, but also in other aspects. You know, data play a key role in how we plan electrification. Data plays a key role in how we use shared mobility. And so there's a kind of real opportunity, I think, for better collaboration. And Andrew, I think I wanted to kind of come to you a little bit, because that's kind of part and parcel of what you do on a daily basis. What are some of the, you know, the positives that you've seen coming out, and where are some of the challenges, and perhaps an example of something that you've recently worked on?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Lucette. So Plexel's methodology is absolutely about open collaboration. So no ego, no hierarchy, but involving everyone relevant, of course. Now, we bring together, therefore, governments, academics, enterprises, technology service providers, startups, and everyone else, you know, general society, just to make sure that when we're embarking on a transformation and innovation program, that we've got perspective from all, and we can understand how we then build up the solution. Now, there's a particular example at the moment which is good reflection on this. So we're working with the UK's innovation agency, which is called Innovate UK, on a grant-based project to look at how we use real-time data and nudge theory to change the way in which people travel to one very notable UK travel hub in the UK. We're doing that in partnership with said travel hub to make sure that the 80,000 employees who go to that destination every day think differently and are presented information differently about their options to travel, and then the implications of the travel that they choose. That's also in partnership with a very large technology service provider that controls how you use data along that journey and how you present data, but also monetize data. I think it's a really good example where there's a series of small and medium enterprises, a series of startups starting to get involved with that as a testbed methodology to think about how we can do something at scale with very clear benefits realization for the customer in question, but also that we can drive an example again at scale that could be a reflection to the rest of society and potentially internationally as well. So, noting we're relatively pressured on time, but the key takeaway is complete open collaboration is the way in which we think these problems will be solved and the opportunities will be availed of. Involve everyone, make sure that there's no egos around the table, there's no particular intent of one party that's going to usurp another, and use a real life example in order to generate progress.
Thanks, Andrew, and a great example. I'm going to ask Manaswini to maybe reflect on that, being a kind of leading technology company. How do you work with kind of startups? And if I may, I might just also throw in a second question that's come in from our audience that I think maybe is one for you as well, asking what are the new revenue models that data from EVs can bring to OEMs or service providers? So if you'd like to reflect on both of those.
Yeah, so this partnership and ecosystem partnership is very, very critical in the both EV as well as autonomous world today. So if you see, I mean, all of you are pretty much up to date on the news. There are highest number of startups who have made a lot of news. I mean, made it to very good success in the autonomous space, and so as we have started to see the EV space as well. All the big names from Silicon Valley, starting from Argo to Cruise, Aurora, recently, been partnered with the truck autonomous industries like Packard and all that. So they are a very key player. So the ecosystem partners are the following. OEMs are the owner who are finally delivering the cars, but traditionally, tier ones were the suppliers and big partners, and the engineering solution providers like us, who kind of do the complete software solutions. But there are two key players who have joined the ecosystem. That is, the first one is the infrastructure player, as I said, the cloud and infrastructure player because of data, because it's purely IT. And the second group who has joined our group is the startups. And why so? Because there are point solutions to be done. There are areas of problem statement which are very exclusive, and as I call point solutions, the startup has to solve, and they need to be integrated with the ecosystem. What the startups need, and the second question you asked, the business model is, the startup should focus on the license revenue, what they monetize from the solution they build, but they have to definitely find a partner for industrialization. What the startup is missing is whatever they have innovated, or just driving a car in a controlled environment saying I have done autonomous, or just a charging station to check once or twice, that cannot be productionized. They need strong and large companies to industrialize their product. So the business model is they should look at the licensing model for their IP, and they should partner with solution providers, say KPID or OEMs or tier ones, who would do the industrialization of their solution to see the day of the light. And that's the model.
Thank you, Manaswini, for that great reflection on the partnership model between the startups and the larger players. I'm very conscious we're coming up close for time, sadly, because there's lots more things to discuss. I'm going to do a quick fire round on a final comment from each of the panels on what you see as the most important challenge you'd like to address, or the biggest disruption that's needed in mobility. You have about 30 seconds to come back to me on that. Maya, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll introduce two, they're quite linked. On one hand, I think it's a sustainable data network, making sure that we create AI models based off the large variety, diversity of data, and to really incorporate everyone that needs to be in any artificial intelligence model in order for it to function at scale. And the macro one is really AI for social good. I think there's a big opportunity here to create AI from the ground up to really benefit society, to make sure that the impact is clear and positive.
Thanks, Maya, for being so succinct. Aparmaya.
Thanks, Lucette. I would like to keep my answer limited to the technological aspect of it, which also ties up to the business angle. On the electrification side, I think it's graphene batteries with ultra capacitors and solid state batteries that can address range anxiety. You have hydrogen fuel cell adoption that France is championing as a country for very good reasons. In the autonomous drive space, there's an opportunity to bring down the power consumption of the compute platform by having an efficient inference engine to optimize the neural networks. Somewhere around 45 watt, like I said earlier, would be the answer. Having your LiDARs and the sensors more efficient, there are situations such as large car parking areas. Imagine the car parking at an airport where the LiDARs doesn't work very well. So there's a need for technology to step up there. In the in-car software, a project like automotive grade Linux that gives you an opportunity to move away from proprietary label software. That's an open source piece of code that gives you operating system, APIs, application framework, all in one package without having to go to a proprietary solution. That to me is innovative. And final point on the mobility space, the shared mobility, a project that Didi Chuxing, the Chinese #1 ride-hailing company, has recently done. They partnered with a OEM in China called BYD. And they've come out with an electric vehicle that they'll use from day one in the ride-hailing space. Now that to me is innovative because it checks all the boxes. It gives Didi Chuxing a new addition to its fleet. It gives the OEM a new car to manufacture, which is honestly their bread and butter. It gives the customers more choice, and it serves the cause of smart mobility because it's an electric vehicle. That would be my take. Thanks, Lucette.
Thank you, Aparmaya. Andrew.
So I've mentioned a few times around open collaboration, and I really would underline, when we think about the multiple industries that are involved in this movement, is trying to stimulate the emergence of owners within those industries. So we were going to talk about 5G and connectivity if we had time, and I think it's a perfect example where if this movement is going to rely on connectivity being available, we need to convince the telecoms industry to deliver ubiquity. And we need to also help them build their business case in order to drive their return on investment.
Very well made point, yes, and we did run out of time to come on to that one. And a final one from Manaswini, please.
Yeah, being the last speaker, I don't have to repeat a lot of good things already the previous speaker. So the last thing, but not the least, is the technical verification and validation. All these are safety critical systems and touching the life of the people on the road. So proper verification and validation and simulation using data, cloud, and all the big high computing infrastructure is the key challenge today.
Thank you, Manaswini. And I think that's a really nice point to end on, because ultimately mobility is for people. So that's I think the one thing to maybe take away from this is, how do we make mobility that works for the people who live in cities and other places? I'm conscious we're about 2 minutes over time, so we've definitely used all we can. I know there's a couple of questions we didn't answer. We might try to come back to those outside of the space. My colleague Molly is going to shortly launch a very brief audience poll. Be really grateful if you could answer that for you. That helps us to make sure that our events remain relevant and are useful to everyone. So please do take a few moments to complete that. I'd like to finish, of course, by thanking both the teams at London Partners and NASSCOM for bringing this event together. As we said, this is the start of a partnership, and we look forward to many more collaborations together, and indeed that open innovation between both of our ecosystems and our companies and startups. I want to, of course, very much thank our panel of experts for their time, but also for their fantastic insights and contributions. I feel there would have been much more to discuss, but sadly we've run out of time. And of course, very big thank you for the audience for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed it, found it useful, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you.